but I was wondering whether you could just give us like a quick step tour of the world and the fertility and how dire or how good the country or a region is situated when it comes to the stable population or the fertility rates.
Yeah, well, none of them really have stable populations. All of them are going to get to the point where they're going to decline. So when we wrote the book, there's it's a lot of data. It's all in the back. So anybody who's reading the book, it's like a long magazine travel log. It's not a. There's only one chart actually in the book. It's not a. And we did it that way on purpose because we wanted people to get into the story because it really is a narrative. It's a story about what's going on. And the bottom line to the story. So to get to the twist, I guess, end of the story is that you can have all of these scientific arguments and all the rest of it, but if you really want to get into why people are not having kids, it's culture. And culture can manifest itself in different ways in different places, but all of it works against having larger numbers of children. And it starts with urbanization and the dramatic effect of urbanization on the world. And people talk a lot about how immigration is a huge has a huge effect on what's going on in terms of population distribution. It actually doesn't. Only about 4% of the global population doesn't live in the country in which it was born. Only 4. 96% of the population lives in the country in which it was born. But that 96 is dramatically redistributing itself. And it's going from an urban, smaller town population to almost every day exclusively more urban. Mm-hmm. And when you leave the countryside where children make a contribution to the economic vitality of a family by, for example, working on the farm, in the city that changes. And the incentive to have more children declines because they don't really make an economic contribution, if ever. But if they do, it's till they're much older than they would on a farm. But also what it really does is it changes the choice structure for women. And instead of being, getting married very early to the person who lives in the farm next door in their lives and starting their family in their late teens and their early 20s, they move to the city. They say, look, I want some more economic independence. I want to make choices that are different than my mother and my grandmother made. And I want to get an education, which takes them out of starting their families. And then I want to get a job, which takes them out from starting their families even longer. And so this pattern exists everywhere, but it manifests itself in different ways in different countries. But everybody's going through the same thing. There's nobody going in the other direction.
So just the speed of change is different in certain cultures rather than the direction of travel.
The direction of travel is the same. When it started is different, and how fast it's going is different.
Okay, so the assumption essentially that Africa is going to be that sort of cradle of the world suddenly, is that presumption essentially made on the assumption that their fertility rates are going to stay stable? And what is the actual evidence behind it? Because I think most people believe that Africa is just going to stay this high fertility country, but the actual data doesn't seem to bear that when you went and dug into it. So what did you see when it comes to Africa?
Well, I mean, even the UN's data shows African fertility declining and pretty rapidly. And they didn't. And when you dig into it more deeply and you actually look at what's happening in the cities, it's declining even faster in the cities and getting closer to replacement rate in places like Nairobi, for example, where we did take a closer look at things. So the same process that happened in all of these other places in the world, Latin America, Asia, North America, Western Europe, it's all happening in Africa. The question is just the speed at which it's going to take place. And if the past is prologue, what happens is each new region of the world moves into this process. It tends to move faster than the region that preceded it. So the question is, how quickly will things move in Africa? And that's what we don't know. And as I said before, Africa has two issues. One is declining fertility, but also that their longevity is not expanding as rapidly as we've seen it in other places. So they have declining fertility, and unless their longevity expands, we might find that the African population constricts faster than we're predicting.
Do we know what's the reason for them not expanding the longevity on the same sort of track or trajectory as the rest of the world?
A lack of public health care. I mean, if that's really the biggest thing that has an effect. I mean, access to all the things that keep us alive for longer, but also, poverty has a huge impact on this, and there's still a tremendous amount of poverty in Africa. The lack of a growing middle class that we see in places like Asia, it's not happening as quickly in a place like Africa, and the middle class has different demands on the political system, and it creates different types of expectations about what governments can deliver, as we've seen in every other part of the world. So yeah, it's not just a population story; it's a political, economic, social organization, cultural story in Africa. It's a complicated place, and the thing that I discover every time I consider it is how little I know. And
Mm.
so most people just kind of look at the number. My feeling is most people just look at the numbers and don't really get underneath actually what's going on. And I think over time, given that everybody is so certain that Africa is going to provide the stability to the population longer term, I think we owe ourselves the responsibility of going out and actually finding out what's going on. I'm not a hugely optimistic about Africa. And the reason I'm not hugely optimistic is because of the level of political instability, the lack of a rapidly growing middle class, and just the disruptive nature of all of the things that are necessary in order to create a region that has economic power as both a set of consumers, but also as producers, but also the political stability in which capital wants to invest there and is assured that they'll be able to create the type of wealth that they would want to get out of any investments that they want to make. Africa's interesting. There's going to be a lot of change in Africa over the next while.
Can you also talk us through the sort of the India's or the strategy that India went down to limit their fertility? Because obviously we know about the one child program and strategy in China, but in your book you actually mentioned that India had the policy that would sometimes even make the Chinese government sort of cringe, or I can't remember exactly the word you used, but I remember that really stayed in my memory because Chinese government did take some really gruesome steps to limit their populations. So
Yeah.
what was going on in India?
Well, the Indian process, there was a lot of emphasis on sterilization. It wasn't so much the national government, although the national government did play a role. It was also the state governments exercising a certain amount of influence in this area, and everything from involuntary fertile sterilizations through to paying people to get sterilized, and all the things that go wrong when people actually say that you're going to get money for doing something, and how people organize it in a local way. It can get problematic. And they also had, and we talk about it in the book, their we two, our two, strategy. We should only have two children. But the problem with looking at India in terms of that through that lens is the same problem that exists with looking at China through that lens, that it was government policy. Government policy contributed to what's going on, but what's really happened is cultural change. That's the biggest effect. It's urbanization and then the cultural change that takes place as a result of that, and how women make different decisions about their lives. I mean, my co-author John Ibbotson, who I wrote Empty Planet with, says that the most powerful image in the book, and people can read this in the chapter on India and China, is not anything about any government people that we talked to or any, and we did talk to a lot of people, all over the world about this, but it was that one scene in a slum in Delhi where I was sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in this little classroom made in basically a mud hut kind of a situation. And I was watching a focus group of younger women talk about what their expectations were about their future families. And they were all saying, look, I want to have control of my own life. That means I have to have my own income, which means I have to have an education. So I'm delaying whatever the process is of, getting pregnant. And I saw, something glow under one of the young women's saris. And she reached in and she pulled out a smartphone and she put it back. And it was like, okay, well, that's over. You can't really control people's understanding about reproduction and how to control their lives if they have access to all the information in the world. They have a data plan. They're able to go out and say, how do I prevent, do a Google search or go on generative AI, do whatever you want. You've got all the information in the world about how you can control your own fertility. So Indian women are doing exactly that, it's the same in China. The tragedy of China was that the fertility rate in China was already going through rapid decline at the time they implemented the one-child policy. All it did was accelerated what was already going on. And if you look at where they are now, where their fertility rate is probably one, the predictions, and these are conservative predictions, I would suggest that they're going to lose half their population through the course of this century. That's the consensus. Even the UN, which I quibble an awful lot with their projections, that's what they have. They're going to lose 660 million people. So you sit back and you say, boy, you want to see a real effective government intervention in this space. There's a great example of it. And the Indian government didn't have that kind of an impact. They certainly probably had some impact, but not as big as in China. But the bigger impact for both was just that people figured out, particularly younger Chinese women and younger Indian women, that there was a different life from the one that their mother or their grandmother led, and they were going to do it by participating in the formal economy and making more of the decisions about their lives. They were going to have more independence in the life that they were going to live, which started with having fewer kids.